There is a one-page document sitting in a federal archive right now that proves a major scientific institution knew exactly what was found, knew exactly what it meant, and wrote a procedure for making sure you would never hear about it. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say on the internet. I get it. I used to roll my eyes at that stuff too. But I am not talking about a theory. I am talking about a specific piece of paper that Daniel, a researcher I have been following for the past several months, physically held in his hands inside a government reading room. One page, unsigned, stamped with a restricted access code that had not been lifted in decades. And the thing that stopped Daniel cold was not what the document described. It was what it instructed. Because it was not a report. It was a protocol, a step-by-step procedure for what to do when field teams recovered skeletal remains from certain earthwork sites that exceeded, and I am quoting directly here, standard morphological parameters. Standard morphological parameters. That is bureaucratic language for bones that are too big. And the protocol did not say study them more carefully. It did not say publish the findings and invite peer review. It said reclassify, restrict access, and merge into general inventory under non-site-specific catalog codes. In plain language, give them a number that cannot be traced back to where they came from. Make them unfindable without destroying them. Daniel told me he sat in that reading room for a long time after he read it. The kind of long time where the fluorescent lights start buzzing louder than they should and the air feels too still. He said the strangest part was how calm the language was. No urgency, no alarm, just clean administrative instructions, the way you would write a procedure for filing expense reports, which told him something important. This was not a panicked response to an unexpected discovery. This was a routine. Someone had written this because this situation had come up before, and they expected it to come up again. Daniel had found his way to this document through months of cross-referencing internal memos that he had requested through public information channels, the kind of requests that take forever and come back mostly redacted. But one batch had come back lighter than expected. A few pages where someone in the processing chain had apparently been less careful with the black marker than they should have been, and buried in that batch, between two completely mundane budget allocation tables, was this page. One page that connected to a thread. And that thread, once Daniel started pulling it, did not stop. If you find this kind of investigation as gripping as I do, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this work reach more people who need to hear it. Because here is the thing Daniel understood almost immediately. The protocol was not the story. The protocol was the proof that there was a story. The real question was what exactly these bones were, where they came from, and what kind of place produced them in large enough numbers that a federal institution needed a standing procedure for handling them. And to understand that, you have to go back 2 years before Daniel ever saw that document. Back to the site itself. Daniel had visited the complex originally out of what he described to me as casual curiosity. He had read a short piece about earthworks in the region, found it interesting, and decided to drive out on a weekend with no real agenda. He told me he expected to find a gentle hill with an information placard and maybe a parking lot. What he found instead genuinely unsettled him, not because of anything supernatural, because of the math. Standing at the base of the main structure and looking up, he said it felt less like looking at a hill and more like looking at the side of a building. The thing rises at a gradient that is too consistent to be natural, covered in grass now, worn smooth by centuries of weather. But underneath that softness, the geometry is relentless, deliberate. When he walked the perimeter of the surrounding complex, the scale kept expanding in ways his brain kept refusing to fully accept. The central open area alone covered more ground than several city blocks. The defensive earthwork on the outer edge had required the movement of an amount of soil that, when Daniel later calculated it, corresponded to thousands of workers laboring for years. Not afternoons, years. He drove home that evening with a question sitting on his chest like a stone. The official explanation for this place credited it to a regional culture that the textbooks described in terms of small farming settlements and seasonal ritual gatherings. And Daniel was not an archaeologist. He was not a scientist. He was just a person who had stood at the base of something enormous and done basic arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not work. The scale of what was built and the scale of what the official story allowed simply did not match, and the gap between those two numbers was, he told me, the most interesting thing he had ever encountered, because gaps like that do not happen by accident. Gaps like that have a reason, And finding that reason is exactly what eventually led him to that reading room, that document, and that one quiet page that changed everything he thought he understood about how history gets written. So Daniel goes back to basics. He goes to the academic literature, the published papers, the university textbooks, the official archaeological reports on sites like the one he visited. And what he finds there is something that on the surface looks like an answer, but functions exactly like a wall. Every site he looks up, every complex that defies easy explanation, every earthwork that requires the kind of labor organization and engineering precision that should prompt serious questions, gets filed under the same broad cultural label. One category, covering centuries of activity, thousands of miles of geography, dozens of distinct settlement types with wildly different scales of construction. And Daniel starts to notice something uncomfortable about how that label works in practice. It does not explain anything. It absorbs everything. You find something that does not fit, you stamp it with the label, and the question disappears into the category like a stone dropped into deep water. No ripple, no follow-up, just silence and the smooth surface of an accepted term. He described it to me as trying to understand a city by calling everything in it a building. Technically accurate, completely useless, and the more papers he read, the more he noticed that the language around anomalous finds had a particular texture to it. Careful, slightly evasive. Like watching someone navigate a room full of furniture in the dark, moving slowly, never quite acknowledging the obstacles they are working around. That is when Daniel decided he needed to talk to someone who had spent their career inside this system. Someone who knew the furniture intimately. Margaret had spent over 3 decades in academic archaeology before retiring. Daniel found her through a footnote in a paper she had written early in her career, a paper that asked, in careful and thoroughly hedged academic language, whether the existing cultural categories were broad enough to accommodate the physical evidence being recovered from large-scale earthwork sites. The paper had not caused a scandal. It had simply been cited less and less over the years, until it effectively stopped existing in the active literature. They met at a coffee shop near the university where she used to teach. She was sharp, precise, and slightly wary in the way that people get when they have learned that certain conversations carry professional costs. Daniel told me she spent the first 20 minutes being perfectly reasonable and perfectly unhelpful, giving him the standard framing, the approved language, the carefully balanced academic responses that acknowledge complexity without committing to anything. And then he asked her one question. He asked her whether she had ever personally encountered physical evidence at a site that the published report on that site did not fully account for. And she stopped. Not for a long time. Just a beat. Just long enough for Daniel to understand that the answer was yes, and that she was deciding how much of yes to give him. What she said was that in her experience, field notes and published reports have a complicated relationship. That is all she said. But that pause before she said it told Daniel everything the published record had spent decades trying to hide. Here is what makes that pause so important. Margaret was not a radical. She was not someone with an agenda. She was a careful, credentialed professional who had spent her life working within the system, and the system had clearly taught her to be very precise about what she said out loud about certain things. That kind of learned precision does not come from nowhere. It comes from watching what happens to people who are less precise. Daniel left that coffee shop with something he had not walked in with. Not a quote he could use, not a confession. Just the certain knowledge that the gap he had noticed standing at the base of that mound was a gap that professionals inside the field could also see, and had made a quiet decision not to discuss too loudly. And that meant the gap was real. It was not a misreading by an untrained observer. It was a known feature of the landscape that the official map simply chose not to mark, which brought Daniel to the next question. If the people inside the system knew the official story was incomplete, then what exactly had they found that the story was leaving out? The answer to that question was sitting in newspaper archives that most people do not know exist, and even fewer people have thought to search. Daniel started with regional papers from the period when major earthwork sites across the interior were first being systematically disturbed by agricultural development and early construction projects, not the national papers. Not the big outlets that shaped the official record, the small ones, the county weeklies, the local gazettes that covered what people in farming communities actually witnessed with their own eyes and reported to their neighbors without any institutional filter. And what he found in those archives, once he started looking, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Because the accounts were not occasional. They were not scattered curiosities separated by decades. They were dense, repetitive, consistent across geography and time, in a way that is very hard to explain if you believe they were simply the product of exaggeration or misidentification. Across more than a dozen different states, across a span of several decades, ordinary people kept describing the same thing. Burial arrangements of clear, deliberate formality, grave goods that pointed toward hierarchy and ritual, and skeletal remains that were, without exception in these accounts, dramatically larger than any living person those witnesses had ever seen. Farmers who had dug wells their whole lives and knew what human bones looked like. Surveyors with professional experience measuring dimensions. Construction foremen who described what they found in matter-of-fact language because to them, it was simply what was there. And the details across all these accounts lined up in ways that are deeply uncomfortable if you take them seriously. Because these people did not know each other. They were not coordinating their stories. They were just reporting what they saw in local papers to local readers who knew them personally and had no reason to doubt them. Daniel counted 17 distinct sequences where the same pattern appeared. Local discovery, local reporting, named witnesses with specific details. And then within weeks, a representative from a federal institution arrived at the site. And after that arrival, in every single case, the local account went quiet. The official version took over. And the official version never mentioned the bones. The man who designed the silence was not a villain. That is the part that took Daniel the longest to accept. Because it would be so much easier if he were. It would be so much cleaner if there were a single bad actor sitting in a dark office somewhere, deliberately and consciously choosing to corrupt the scientific record for personal gain. But the truth, as Daniel found it, is more unsettling than that. Because the man who built the institutional framework that swallowed all of this evidence was, by every account, a genuine believer, a true convert to a particular story about the past. And true believers are far more dangerous than cynics, because cynics know they are lying, and sometimes that knowledge slows them down. True believers never slow down at all. Daniel spent weeks piecing together the history of the institution that had sent representatives to all 17 of those sites. The one that had arrived, collected, reinterpreted, and published the official versions that replaced the local eyewitness accounts. The founding director, a man Daniel came to think of simply as the architect, had built his career on a specific theory. His theory was that the continent's past was essentially simple. That the people living on the land when outside settlers arrived were the same people who had always lived there, had always built at the same modest scale, had always existed at roughly the same level of complexity. This theory was not arrived at through rigorous analysis of the physical evidence. Daniel found the early correspondence, the internal letters written before the institution was even formally established, and the conclusion was already there in the first letter. The theory preceded the evidence by years. The institution was not built to discover whether the theory was correct. It was built to make the theory permanent. Every classification system, every field protocol, every publication standard that the architect established was engineered, whether consciously or not, to route all incoming evidence toward the conclusion that was already waiting for it. Daniel described it to me as a funnel built in the shape of an answer. Whatever you poured in came out the same way. And the protocol that Daniel had found in that archive reading room, the one that instructed field teams to reclassify oversized remains and merge them into untraceable inventory, that protocol fit the funnel perfectly. It was not an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. What Daniel found hardest to sit with was the timeline of the architect's career alongside the political events happening in the same years. The institution was established precisely at the moment when large territories were being formally incorporated into the national domain, and the populations living on them were being removed and relocated. The legal framework for that removal required a specific kind of history, a history in which the land had never been home to anything more complex than small, loosely organized communities without deep institutional roots. Because deep institutional roots create complicated questions about legitimacy, about who actually has the longer claim. The architect's theory answered those questions before they could be asked. It said, in the authoritative language of science, that there was nothing here of great age or complexity, that the mounds were recent. That the civilizations were simple, that the land was, in the ways that mattered legally and morally, essentially available. Daniel laid out the timeline for me on a piece of paper once, the institutional publications on one side, the major land and territory decisions on the other, and the parallelism was not subtle. Every time a major site was officially declared understood and closed to further independent inquiry, something significant happened to the land around it within a few years. The architect never wrote about land policy. He never commented on the political events of his time. He was a scientist, focused on science, but his science kept producing exactly the conclusions that the political moment required. And that, Daniel told me quietly, is either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of American scholarship, or it is something else entirely. Because once Daniel had the institutional history mapped out, he went back to the land records, and that is where the story stopped being about archaeology entirely and became something much colder and much harder to dismiss. He pulled the land transaction records for the regions surrounding the major earthworks sites. The ones that had been officially resolved, officially categorized, officially filed away under the broad cultural label that explained everything by explaining nothing. And he started matching dates. The date a site received its official institutional report. The date independent researchers were formally excluded from further access. The date the surrounding land changed hands or changed use. And the gap between those dates across site after site was not years. It was months, sometimes weeks. Someone was watching the official reports very closely. Someone knew that once the institutional seal went on a site, the questions stopped and the transactions could begin. Daniel found one case where a land sale contract had been drawn up with acreage descriptions and price terms 4 days before the official report on the nearby earthworks site was even published. 4 days, which meant someone had read that report before it was public, which meant someone had a relationship with the institution that went beyond ordinary scientific interest. The architect had built a machine that produced clean history. And clean history, it turned out, had a very specific and very measurable market value. And the people paying that value were not paying for knowledge, they were paying for silence, wrapped in the respectable packaging of peer-reviewed science. And that packaging had been so effective, so durable, so thoroughly trusted by every generation of researchers trained within it, that it was still working perfectly more than a century later. The National Institution holds a collection of skeletal remains from archaeological sites across the continent that numbers in the tens of thousands of individual specimens. Tens of thousands, and not one systematic public record exists showing the dimensions of what is in that collection. Daniel submitted his formal information requests on a Tuesday morning, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee going cold beside him, and the responses that came back over the following months were some of the most elaborately useless documents he had ever received. Technically complete, functionally empty, page after page of catalog references organized in a proprietary internal classification system that had no publicly available key. It was like being handed a library where every book had its cover removed and its title replaced with a code that only the librarians could read, and the librarians were not taking questions. Daniel brought in Kevin, a data analyst he knew through a mutual contact, someone who had spent years working with large institutional databases and understood how organizations structure information when they want it to exist, but not to be found. Kevin spent 3 weeks with the catalog material. He built cross-reference tables. He mapped collection codes against known excavation records from published reports. He traced acquisition dates against the site timelines Daniel had already assembled. And what Kevin found was a specific and repeatable pattern of absence. Specimens that appeared in field documentation as collected, as physically removed from a site and transferred to institutional custody, had no corresponding entries in the catalog under any code variation he could identify. They had not been destroyed. Destroyed specimens leave paperwork, disposal records, deaccession notices. These had none of that. They simply existed in the field notes and then stopped existing in any traceable form. Kevin described it to Daniel as objects that had been filed in a room with no address. The room existed, the objects were in it, but the filing system had been deliberately designed so that you could not find the room unless you already knew exactly where it was. Daniel sent 3 follow-up requests to the institution asking for clarification on the gaps Kevin had identified. The responses were form letters, identical language each time, warm, professional, completely uninformative. The kind of letters written by people trained to respond without answering. What struck Daniel most was not the gaps themselves. It was the engineering required to create them. Because making thousands of specimens functionally invisible without destroying them is not an accident. It is not the result of poor record keeping or institutional disorganization. It requires deliberate design. Someone had to sit down and build a classification system specifically structured to prevent cross-referencing. Someone had to make decisions about which specimens got assigned to site-specific codes and which ones got absorbed into general inventory categories with no locational metadata. That decision had been made consistently, across decades, across multiple institutional administrations, which meant it was not a personal decision. It was policy. And policy has authors. Policy has the people who wrote it, and the people who enforced it, and the people who trained the next generation to follow it without asking why. The collection was not a scientific archive. It was a managed absence, constructed with the same quiet professionalism that the architect had brought to everything else he built. Daniel sat with that for a long time, and then he did something that shifted the entire shape of what he was looking at. He stopped focusing on what was missing from the collection and started looking at what was actually there. The officially acknowledged material, the artifacts and specimens that had made it into published reports, into museum displays, into the approved scientific literature. Because if the suppressed evidence and the approved evidence were both pointing in the same direction, then the institution had not just failed to hide the truth, it had accidentally put the truth on display, in a glass case with a label on it, in a room that anyone could walk into. The ceremonial objects recovered from major earthwork sites and published in official reports are, if you look at them with fresh eyes, absolutely extraordinary. Daniel pulled the catalog images, the published photographs, the detailed descriptions from excavation reports across multiple major sites. And the first thing that hits you is the consistency. Objects recovered from sites separated by hundreds of miles, by river systems and mountain ranges and every kind of natural barrier you can imagine, share iconographic elements that are precise enough to suggest they were produced within the same artistic tradition. Not similar, not loosely related, precisely consistent, the way a logo stays consistent across every office of a large company, the way a uniform stays consistent across every member of the same organization. The same figures in the same postures with the same symbolic objects rendered in the same proportional relationships, in copper, in carved stone, in fired clay, across a geographic spread that covers an area larger than most countries. And the official archaeology acknowledges this. It is right there in the published reports, described carefully and accurately in the passive institutional language that academic papers use. It is acknowledged and then it is not explained. The papers describe the distribution, they map it, they measure it, and then they move on without asking the question that the distribution obviously demands. How? How does a shared symbolic language, this precise, this consistent, this geographically vast, exist without the kind of organized communication network that would leave its own evidence behind? The official answer, when it appears at all, is cultural diffusion. Ideas spreading gradually through trade contact and imitation. But cultural diffusion produces variation. It produces regional adaptation and local interpretation and gradual drift. It does not produce the kind of locked, precise consistency that Daniel was looking at in those catalog images. Cultural diffusion looks like a game of telephone where the message changes as it travels. What Daniel was seeing looked like everyone had received the same original memo, and then there were the carved figurines. Two of them in particular, recovered from one of the major sites and published in an official report with full photographic documentation that stopped Daniel completely the first time he saw them. The anatomical accuracy, the surface finish, the quality of the stonework. These were not objects produced by a community that carved things occasionally between seasons of farming. These were objects produced by someone who had devoted years, possibly decades, to mastering a specific craft, which meant a society that could afford to keep a specialist alive and fed while they did nothing but perfect that craft, which meant surplus, which meant organized agriculture at a scale that produced reliable excess, which meant administrative systems to manage and distribute that excess, which meant, when you follow the chain all the way, a civilization far more organized and far more complex than the official label had ever suggested. The evidence was sitting in the approved record the whole time, polished, cataloged, photographed, sitting in a glass case in a public building that anyone could walk into, and the institution had kept it safe for over a century by doing something very clever. It had surrounded it with an explanation just adequate enough to make most people stop looking. The three young archaeologists Daniel spoke to had never heard of any of it. Not the regional newspaper accounts, Not the 17 sequences he had documented, not the protocol he had found in the archive, not Margaret's careful pause over coffee, nothing. And these were not careless people. They were sharp, genuinely curious, professionally committed researchers in their 30s who had spent years studying exactly the kind of sites Daniel had been investigating. He met them separately, at different points in his research, through different channels, and each conversation followed the same arc. They were engaged, thoughtful, generous with their time. And when Daniel started describing what he had found, the same thing happened with all three of them. Not dismissal, not hostility. Something quieter and more final than either of those. A kind of polite blankness, the look of someone hearing a language they have never been taught and therefore genuinely cannot process. They did not know what Daniel was describing because the education that had shaped everything they knew had been built in a way that made certain questions feel like they belonged to a different field entirely. Not wrong questions, just not archaeology questions. The boundary had been drawn so early in their training, reinforced so consistently through every paper they had read and every supervisor who had shaped their thinking, that they could not see the boundary itself. They just experienced everything outside it as noise. Daniel told me about one conversation in particular that stayed with him. One of the three, a researcher named Chris, who specialized in material culture analysis, had actually worked on a site that appeared in Daniel's newspaper archive research. A site where a local account from decades earlier had described the discovery of remains that did not match the official dimensions. Daniel described the account to Chris in general terms without mentioning the site name. Chris listened carefully, nodded, and said that kind of reporting was common in that period and was generally understood to reflect the unreliability of untrained observers under conditions of excitement and unfamiliarity. It was a fluent, confident answer, the exact answer that the institutional framework had prepared him to give. And then Daniel told him which site the account was from, the site Chris had personally worked on, and Chris went quiet. Not the considering quiet of someone thinking through a new idea, the tight quiet of someone whose mental furniture had just been rearranged without their permission. He recovered quickly. He gave Daniel a careful, measured response about the complexity of cross-referencing historical accounts with modern excavation data, but his hands had stopped moving while he talked, and Daniel noticed, because Daniel always noticed the pauses now. Margaret had taught him to look for them. What Daniel understood after those three conversations was something that took him a while to fully accept, because it was more disturbing in some ways than deliberate concealment. The erasure had become self-sustaining. The people carrying it forward were not carrying anything. They were simply living inside a room that had been built for them before they arrived, furnished with the questions they were allowed to ask, and bare of the questions they were not. Nobody had to instruct them to ignore certain evidence. The curriculum had done that work so thoroughly and so early that the ignoring felt like natural professional judgment. That is what a century of institutional design produces. Not a conspiracy that requires ongoing maintenance. A worldview that reproduces itself through normal education and feels, from the inside, exactly like rigorous science. And yet the newspaper archives are still there. That is the thing that Daniel kept coming back to, the thing that I keep coming back to now. The original field notes from early excavations, the ones that survived institutional processing, are still there in regional historical collections and university libraries and local archive rooms that smell of old paper and radiator heat. The letters written by the architect and his contemporaries, the ones that show the conclusion preceding the evidence by years, are still there in collections that anyone with a researcher's card can access. The land transaction records that Daniel had matched against the institutional report dates are public documents. The catalog gaps that Kevin had mapped are visible to anyone who submits the same information requests and brings the same analytical patience to the responses. Nothing was burned, nothing was shredded. The machinery of concealment had been built not on destruction, but on difficulty, on the reasonable expectation that most people would not have the time or the stubbornness or the specific combination of skills that Daniel had spent years assembling almost by accident, starting from a weekend drive to a grassy mound and a question that would not leave him alone. The mounds themselves are still standing. Daniel went back to the site one more time after everything he had learned. He told me he stood at the base of the main structure in the early morning, when the mist was still sitting in the low ground around it, and the light was coming in at a flat angle that made the geometry of the thing even harder to dismiss than it had been on his first visit. He said it felt different this time, not larger, not more mysterious, just more patient, like something that had been waiting a very long time for the right people to stop walking past it and actually look. And that, I think, is the real shape of what Daniel found across all those months of research, all those archive rooms and information requests and careful conversations with people who paused in exactly the right places. The truth about this place, about what was built here and by whom and at what scale, was never fully buried. It was made to require effort. It was made to cost something, time and persistence, and the willingness to follow a thread past the point where most people let go. The difficulty was the design, and the design assumed that difficulty would be enough. For most people, for most of history, it was. Here is what this whole story comes down to. When an institution is built to produce a conclusion rather than find one, everything it touches gets bent toward that conclusion. The evidence, the language, the education, the professional instincts of everyone trained inside it. And the most complete version of that bending is the one where the people doing the work no longer know there is any bending happening at all. That is not science. That is architecture. Someone built a room and taught everyone born inside it that the room was the whole world. Daniel found a door. The newspaper archives are the door. The field notes are the door. The land records are the door. The gaps in the catalog are the door. The pauses that people like Margaret and Chris cannot quite control are the door. None of it requires you to believe anything dramatic or extraordinary. It only requires you to be willing to look at what is actually in the record and ask why the official version and the documented evidence do not match. That gap, the one Daniel noticed standing at the base of that mound doing basic arithmetic, that gap is still there. It has always been there, and now you know it is there too. So here is the question I want to leave you with. If the evidence was never destroyed, only made difficult to reach, what does it say about us that for over a century almost nobody reached for it? Is it that we trusted the institutions too much? Or is it that somewhere, quietly, we preferred not to know? Write your answer below. I genuinely want to read it. And if this story made you think, made you question something you thought was settled, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps more people find this kind of work. And right now, more people finding it is exactly what this story needs.